Gen Zs are eating the rich, and African politicians are faster on the menu. Gen Zs are tired. They're tired of the extra fancy and the opulence from the political class and their circles. And you know what they're doing? They're upping the pressures. Kenyans will say, another shingle. This is a group that is unable to meet their basic needs. And so they've taken matters into their own hands. They're mobilizing on social media and they're hitting the streets in large numbers. And this is happening all.
Please don't.
Gen Zs are eating the rich, and African the pressures. Kenyans will say, another shingle. This is a group that is unable to meet their basic needs. And so they've taken matters into their own hands. They're mobilizing on social media and they're hitting the streets in large numbers. And this is happening all across Africa. Take more.
There we go. Welcome to This Week in Africa, Gen Z Revolution Loading, how young Africans are toppling corrupt leaders. Before we get into today's stories, we'd like to start with introductions. So I will turn it over to you for your introduction before I introduce myself. I think you're muted.
Oops, my bad. Hello, everybody. My name is Gloria Ayo. I am host and creator of The African Story and co-host with Mr. Hotagwa on This Week in Africa.
And I am Joe Hotagwa, founder of Authentic African. Our goal is to get people to do one of three things: visit, move, and invest in the continent of Africa. Our goal is to bridge the gap between Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora. So this week, we have a number of different stories that we will be reviewing. We're going to be talking about protests around Africa and the Gen Z revolution. We're also going to be talking about South Africa and Ramaphosa's continued case against the ICJ, in the ICJ against Netanyahu and Israel. Madagascar coup leader naming a business man as the new prime minister and the youth's response to that. Senegalese report that was released on the French atrocities from 1944, and also Russia and Morocco strengthening ties in a new pact in a historic number of agreements. But before we do, let's get back into that video that we started the live stream with. And some more context too. There have been a number of protests around the continent, right? We've seen protests erupt in Nigeria, demanding the release of Kanu. We've seen the stand-ups here, South Africa, and Enough is Enough march to demand Ramaphosa's resignation. Cameroon on edge after disputed presidential election. We saw a protest in Madagascar. We saw protests in Kenya, of course, as you mentioned, we talked about before. And in some cases, we've seen complete shifts and changes. In other cases, we have seen slight changes, like in the case of Madagascar, with a new prime minister being installed. In Kenya with Ruto last year, now I think it was, firing his entire cabinet. But is it enough? At least actions are being taken. It seems like political leadership across the continent is becoming aware. And let's just see if we're getting the outcomes that we'd like. But before we give our thoughts, we will play a video and give some commentary on the other side.
Morocco, for example, protests erupted over $35 billion World Cup spending while hospitals crumble and basic healthcare fails. In Madagascar, 7 years into power, Rajoelina hasn't delivered clean water and electricity. These are basic needs, and that's why frustration is boiling over. And in Kenya, the mother of all protests, anti-finance bill protests ignited over proposed taxes on basic goods. And do you know what this says? Deep economic frustrations lie within. And it's not just Africa, globally, Indonesia, Peru. Young people flooding the streets. They're protesting crime, corruption, and unemployment. And do not underestimate their wrath. Gen Zs in Nepal forced the government to step down. The results are imminent and they're clear as day. In Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo voted out with a record defeat. And in Madagascar, the government was dissolved, the military has taken over. You see, the thing about Gen Zs is they refuse to let poor governance steal the future that they've worked hard for and the future that they were promised. So they're interrogating every policy, every bill, every development agenda, and they're asking questions. What's the need from me? But most importantly, what's the need for the country. Political godfathership is over, done with. They've broken that. They're speaking directly to the government, both online and offline. And trust you me, they ensure that you hear them loud and clear. And for leaders who don't understand that, you cannot govern Gen Zs. You don't govern them. You govern with them. They will continue to meet you in the streets until you do.
Well put. I just want to make one point of correction. That that change that they were talking about with under Ghana was under the previous administration. The president of Ghana is President Mahama at this very point in time. So, Gloria, your thoughts on the Gen Z protests around the continent and what you see in terms of the changes happening?
Yes, so there is a wave of protests. I think in Nigeria, it's more of everybody. They're not necessarily tagging a Gen Z. But if there was anything similar to that, obviously it would be the End SARS protest, which actually the anniversary of the End SARS protest was just a few days ago, October 20, 2020. And on that day, there was a protest for the release of IPOB leader. IPOB is the Independent People of Biafra. I've shared before on this platform how back in the day, the Nigerian Civil War that happened between 1967 and 1970 was as a result of a certain region, the eastern region, mostly the Igbos, wanting to be separated from Nigeria due to marginalization and other things that they felt the government had neglected to do as it related to them. That caused the war because it now became a thing of Biafra versus Nigeria. And Biafra was actually independent. It seceded for those 3 years, and eventually they were captured by the Nigerian government. The Nigerian government reabsorbed Biafra. Since then, there's been a lot of tension throughout Nigeria. Obviously, tribalism, we saw that play out during the 2023 election. Now, Nnamdi Kanu is the leader of IPOB, again, the independent people of Biafra, or rather, the indigenous people of Biafra. The indigenous people of Biafra seek to secede, as was attempted in 1967. They're asking for secession from Nigeria because they feel that marginalization has not been addressed. And I have to say, during the 2023 election, we saw it play out. We saw what happened when Peter Obi, who is of Igbo extraction, we saw what happened with that election and how that is still controversial till date. Not only was it controversial, that election divided Nigerians further along ethnic lines, something that the British, if you watch this story on my page, how Nigeria was formed, and that also applies to other African countries. It shows you how that divide and conquer tactic was weaponized, and that is still being weaponized, and the people still play into that. They keep falling into that. But anyway, so during the anniversary of NSARS, people came out to protest the arrest of Nnamdi Kanu. Nnamdi Kanu has been arrested despite a 2022 Court of Appeal judgment that actually discharged and acquitted him. This was later overturned by the Supreme Court. But it's like, why aren't you just letting the man go? Now, I don't like tribalization of this issue, regardless of reservations around Nnamdi Kanu's ideologies. The point remains, I mean, we cannot run from the fact that the Nigerian government has been unconstitutional, especially in light of the list of people that President Tinubu recently pardoned, which we have talked about right here on This Week in Africa. That list has people, for instance, a woman who unalived her husband, people who have been accused of peddling hard stuff. Read between the lines. These people were actually pardoned. This is also against the backdrop of people who have been accused of terrorism, not banditry, as they might like to make you think, terrorism, who actually have been pardoned by the government. Yet people are asking, why is Nnamdi Kanu still being, imprisoned? What exactly is the issue? Charge him to court. That is his right. But they're not releasing him. Matter of fact, his lawyer also got arrested, all during this protest that just happened. So this has become a huge conversation in Nigeria. Oh, and back to the protest. The protesters were actually attacked. They were shot at. There was tear gas. And this has always been my concern when it comes to Africa. I mean, when we're talking about these protests that are going on throughout Africa, we saw what happened in Madagascar. It came with people, losing lives. We talk about the protests going on in Morocco. We talk about Cameroon. It's like it's always deadly. And that's my big concern when it comes to African leaders. the kinds of examples that we see. You know, when one person does something, it becomes popular and everybody starts emulating that. What we need now as a continent are better examples in leadership. And so far, we only have a handful of good examples. African leaders throughout the continent are largely hard to imitate. They are definitely not a good reflection of the kind of society we want, the kind of societies we want for African future.
Well put. I mean, I don't really have much else to add, except I'll say this, you know, and I think I've mentioned this before, you know, in the West, especially in the United States, right? One of the amendments to the Constitution is the freedom of speech. The number one amendment is freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, right? And the ability to be able to peacefully protest anything that you feel is unjust. And we've seen a wave of protests around the United States. And in many cases, there is upset when the police and or sometimes the military has been called in. And as many as these protests that happen, and as we know, anybody injured or hurt or experiencing loss of life is a tragedy. It does not come close to what you see in other places where protests happen, right? On every single protest, you hear an X number of people have experienced loss of life. And so that just shows the bravery that these people all have to go out, and that shows how tired they are of the status quo, right? They're deciding to go out in the streets and potentially risk their lives, all for a hope to change what is happening with their governments. And many of them don't feel like they're represented in government. As you mentioned, some of the things that occurred in the last election in Nigeria, there are things that people talk about in all the other elections around the continent. And that's how you end up with military leadership, right? In countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, because people don't feel like they're represented in that political office. And so I hope that these do bring change. And I do think that when you see these kinds of protests and these things happening, it does begin to build a new political class and people who are, encouraged to get into politics who may never have thought about it before. And, the hope is that it ends up bringing to bear folks that are really thinking about the country. And when they get into office, they continue on the path that they had, started while they were, protesters. Because one of the things I think that people don't realize is how difficult it is to run a country. And it's always that concept or that idea, what happens when the pirates take over the ship, right? And so I do hope that when they do get into office, we do see the change that they are all looking for. So with that, we can move on to some of the next stories. I think the next one we had on the list was South Africa and Ramaphosa continuing, the ICJ case. And this is the International Criminal, the International Criminal Court. ICC is International Criminal Court, but the ICJ is, I can't remember what the J stands for, but basically it's, was it international?
I'll find it.
Yeah, but anyway, the case against Israel will continue despite the deal that Israel and Palestine have entered into, the peace deal and the ceasefire, which has already been violated.
Oh, I'm sorry. International Court of Justice.
International Court of Justice, so the ICJ. Okay, so we will play this video and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has said that while the country, South Africa, applauds the US-brokered Israel-Hamas ceasefire, it will not change anything about South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice against Israel. The court is seized with determining whether Israel committed genocide in Gaza in retaliation for Hamas taking more than 250 people hostage from Israel 2 years ago on the 7th of October. Answering questions in the National Council of Provinces, the South African president said that the country would continue to advocate for Palestinians and the deal has nothing to do with South Africa's case in the Hague court. Ramaphosa said that despite the ceasefire, Israel still has to answer for the atrocities committed in Gaza. After the court granted an extension in April, Israel is now due to deliver its counter memorial containing its response to South Africa's main arguments. After concluding the first phase of the hostage swap on Monday, in which 20 living Israeli hostages were released by Hamas in exchange for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, Trump appealed for a phase 2 of the ongoing negotiations between Israel and Gaza. Now, the US president said the job is not done and added that the dead have not been returned as promised. As of now, major uncertainties remain as key issues, including when Hamas will return the bodies of all hostages believed dead, and Israel's demand that a weakened Hamas should disarm. These core issues, they still remain unresolved, along with the core issue of whether there will be a Palestinian state.
All right. So, your thoughts, Gloria, on the continued ICJ case by South Africa?
Right. South Africa's decision to pursue this case under the 1948 Genocide Convention is very significant because the convention was actually adopted in the wake of the Holocaust, obviously a historical trauma that gives this allegation immense moral and political weight. Now, both South Africa and Israel are actually signatories, which grants the ICJ jurisdiction over disputes concerning the interpretation or application of the convention. Now, the most significant historical antecedent is South Africa's own experience, as we all know, with the crime of apartheid, its condemnation as a pariah state by the international community. For over 4 decades, I think it was 4 decades, the apartheid regime defied international law and global condemnation. The current ruling party, the ANC, and its liberation movement allies like the late Nelson Mandela consistently aligned themselves with the Palestinian struggle, famously stating our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. So this is a psychological and moral foundation of the case, a perceived moral and historical obligation to use the tools of international law, which were instrumental in isolating the apartheid regime against what it views as a system of oppression. South Africa's decision to pursue this case under the 1948 Genocide Convention is again significant because now it's South Africa's way of coming out to say we're standing on that which we once stood against, or standing on that which we once stood for. Now, this brings to mind what happened in Congo, because Joe, last week you mentioned that you would like to see, our leaders, give the same energy to causes on the continent, and we're not dismissing, what's going on in Palestine. But that was a very valid point what you brought up last week, because South Africa did try to help out in Congo, and that got very complicated to where they had to leave Congo because it got really, really weird. But we think of places like Sudan, we think of places like Congo. We really would like for our leaders to give a lot of energy. We talked about the United Nations General Assembly, where we had even, the Vice President of Nigeria fighting for Palestine. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, we have things going on. We have terrorism going on in the country, and not a word was shared, regarding that. So we want our leaders to also give that energy to causes on the continent. Again, the Palestine situation is extremely important, but so are the issues going on in Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Morocco, everywhere. Thank you very much.
Yeah, all great points. And look, at the end of the day, this case was based on what had been happening and still in some cases continuing to happen, because even though there was a ceasefire, there was some things happening with Hamas, and also, Israel had another strike afterwards, after the peace deal. So, but I mean, the estimates are over 100,000 lives have been lost, right, in this process. And, I think there are many people who have disputes about the definition of genocide and what it actually means. I think it's kind of a loose definition, but if you listen to the rhetoric of some of the military leaders in Israel and some of the folks in senior leadership there, I think there is no disputing that their belief system matches that of what genocide in actual practice looks like. And then those were the people that were leading the attacks. So it's not hard to make that correlation between their ideology and those actions meeting at the point of what could be considered a genocide. And then to your point earlier, and so yes, I will say it makes sense for South Africa to continue to pursue that, because as you mentioned, historically, this has been something that, leaders in South Africa have all spoken about. And what people mostly remember is, some of the viral clips of Nelson Mandela specifically speaking on this topic. And so, yeah, I mean, we'd love to see people continue that fight. And of course, Ramaphosa is of the party of Nelson Mandela, right? It's a different party than it was when he was there, but it is the same political party. And so, and then to that other point, yes, I'd love to see some of the same energy for Africa, right? And, to your point, I think them having involved themselves in the Congo and having to leave, I think was probably part of the reason maybe why they don't spend too much time talking about what's happening there. And maybe why other African leaders don't. And sometimes, people say we don't want to air our dirty laundry to the rest of the world. But I mean, it's obvious and it's clear what's happening, right? So at the end of the day, they do need to step in and keep that same energy for what's happening on the continent and look for solutions to solve the challenges happening there, as well as, talking about atrocities around the world. But I do think it matters what's happening on the continent. It's important to focus on those things as well. So yes, and coming back to the conversation of, and by the way, I will say that it's interesting that, obviously Ramaphosa is still pushing this forward. And at the same time, the Gen Zs have been protesting him and asking him to leave office. Yes. I'm not sure where people are of Ramaphosa's wealth, but he is a very, very wealthy individual. And many South Africans feel like, much of that wealth isn't distributed properly. And, many times people feel like the government is able to enrich themselves and not helping the people of their country. So, yeah. Did you have any additional thoughts on that before we move on to the next one?
Well, Joe put me onto Ramaphosa's wealth, and I haven't been able to unsee it. Thanks, Joe.
Massive. It's massive. If you guys want to do a Google search, feel free. There are all kinds of graphics on like which companies he has interest in, and it is massive. His wealth is massive. Yeah, very, by any international standards, to be clear, by all international standards. Okay, so moving back to the conversation of protests, because what we talked about here was, obviously that in the first block, we talked about the protests around the continent and how in some cases we've seen some changes. And Madagascar's new military leader after those protests chose a prime minister, but he has failed to get approval from the Gen Z protesters. Madagascar's Gen Z protest movement expressed concern over the military leader's appointment of the prime minister and said that the decision was made without consultation. The Gen Z MADA movement argued that the appointment was contrary to the spirit of the change and renewal. The youth leaders have vowed to continue mobilizing and claim that they would not allow old practices to be passed off as something new. So this came after the new military leader appointed the former chairman of one of the banks as the country's prime minister on the 20th of October, so just a couple days ago. The new leader himself took the oath as the president of Madagascar last week after the youth-led protests led to the ouster of the former president. So with that, let's watch this video and we'll give some commentary on the other side.
And let's shift our focus now to the East African nation of Madagascar. where the country's newly formed government and youth protesters seem to have come to loggerheads. The country's new military leader, Michael Randrianirina's prime ministerial candidate choice, did not sit well with the Gen Z protesters. Now, in a statement, leaders of Madagascar's Gen Z protest movement disapproved of the appointment of Heron Salama Rajanarivelo as the prime minister. They expressed worry and said that the decision was made without dialogue. The Gen Z movement argued that the new premier's appointment was contrary to the spirit of change and renewal. The youth leaders have vowed to continue mobilizing, claiming that they would not allow old practices to be passed off as something new. They also added that they won't let their revolution be hijacked. Now, the disapproval followed the appointment of Rajanarivelo on Monday. Madagascar's military leader defended his premier choice and said that Rajanarivelo has the skill and the experience for the post, and added that he has relations with international organizations in other countries. Now, the appointment came after the new president promised a civilian government in the country. Randrianirina himself took oath as Madagascar's president last week. He led the elite CAPSAT army unit, which joined the anti-government protests and mutinied on the 11th of October.
All right, that video is pretty long, so we won't spend much more time watching it. But your thoughts on this new appointment and how the Gen Z protesters have responded to it?
Yes, so Madagascar has experienced multiple coups and attempted coups since gaining independence from France in 1960. This current crisis is actually an echo of the 2009 coup d'etat, which ironically first brought the recently ousted Andry Rajoelina to power. In 2009, Rajoelina, who was then mayor of Antananarivo, led mass protests against the president at the time, and the military's CAPSAT unit then backed Rajoelina, which actually enabled the unconstitutional transfer of power. Now, Rajoelina was installed as the transitional leader, and because of this, he was internationally isolated. I mean, you know how it goes. It lost foreign aid. His country faced sanctions. He later returned to power through elections, which were marred by boycotts and fraud allegations. Now, this current event simply inverts the roles. A populist ruler, Rajoelina, is now being toppled by protests that were supported by the same military elite, CAPSAT, only to be replaced by a new transitional leader who uses a similar playbook of appointing a civilian figure, basically to court international acceptance. The appointment of a highly credentialed businessman like, how do you pronounce his name? Rajanarivelo. Mm-hmm. The names are very unique and I love them. Rajanarivelo he's a businessman. He's a former chairman of BNI Madagascar. He's a figure in the Malagasy Employers Association. He basically also follows a well-worn playbook when it comes to African coups, particularly those that seek to mitigate international sanctions. By appointing a figure with the kind of experience he has, the military leader is basically signaling that they're focused on economic recovery and fiscal stability, something the IMF and Western donors would love to hear. But the Malagasy Gen Z see through all of that. And we understand why. I mean, they literally organized protests that came with unalivement of their people. They had to parade their people during the protest who were lifeless to show the intensity of their passion. And they were able to successfully collapse the previous government. So them publicly denouncing this move because they feel it's non-transparent, it's definitely on point. They have a solid point, because basically what they fought for, their popular revolution for structural change, it feels like it's been hijacked by a familiar power elite.
Well put. I really don't have much more to add there. I think that, it's tough when you see what you think is it seems like their movement was hijacked. That's what it looks like, right? I mean, that's just really what it comes down to. So the idea of taking to the streets and pushing for change, and then to see that the very person who ended up in that place ends up not being really aligned with you, but just used you to get to office, I think is hugely disappointing. And and it's not what we anticipated when we saw these protests in the first place. I am interested to see how things go, right? Because as you mentioned, 2009 was the last coup. It can happen again, right? And so I'm interested to see. But and one of the things we've talked about in previous discussions is, I think you had mentioned, and I think I also touched on it a bit. Not every time that we have a coup, it's the outcome that we want. Right. And so just keep in mind that, sometimes you have a coup and you end up in a place where you're not happy with what the leaders end up doing. So we'll keep a close eye on this, and we will absolutely continue to keep you guys abreast of what is happening. With that, let's move on to the next story. And so the next story is, now we're moving over to Senegal, which has released a report into the 1944 massacre, one of the worst atrocities in French colonial history, where African troops were unalived for protesting against alleged racism and pay delays. These soldiers, who had fought for France in World War II, were massacred by French forces at a camp near Dakar. So the official report presented by President Faye called the unalivings premeditated and accused France of altering records to conceal the truth. While the French military said that 35 to 75 soldiers were unalived, historians assert that the actual toll was around 400. So French military said 35 to 75. Historians who have gone and done the actual research say the number is close to 400. So Senegal has demanded an official apology and a proper investigation from France. Although France acknowledged this happening in 2024, questions remain about the victims' identities and their burial sites. So we will play this video and we will have some commentary on the other side.
And our last story today is from Senegal. The former French colony has released a report on the killing of dozens of African troops by French forces in 1944. These soldiers had fought for France during the Second World War, and they were reportedly killed for protesting against racism and pay delays. The official report presented to President Bassirou Diomaye Faye on Thursday looks into one of the worst massacres in the colonial history of France. The killings took place more than 8 decades ago. Most of the perpetrators are now dead, and France is no longer a colonial power in West Africa. However, the investigation could still eventually lead to demands for reparations. The report said that killings of African troops were premeditated.
The report we are receiving today marks a decisive step in restoring historical truth. This document represents much more than a simple report. It is a narrative by us and for ourselves, based on tangible facts drawn from the archives we hold here and in France.
Fondé sur des faits tangibles, puisés dans les archives que nous détenons ici et en France.
The violent incident took place at the Traoré military camp just outside Dakar in 1944. In the month of November that year, around 1,300 soldiers from several West African nations were sent to the Traoré camp after being captured by Germany while fighting for France. The group comprised of soldiers from Senegal, Ivory Coast, and what are now Mali and Burkina Faso. Soon, the African troops started protesting against pay delays. They also sought same pay as white soldiers. Now, to crush the rebellion, the French forces opened fire on the protesting soldiers on the 1st of December. It has been more than 8 decades now, but the questions about the number of soldiers killed, their identities, and the location of their burial remain unanswered.
Wow. So that's quite a long video. So you can watch the video. The link is in the description if you do want to go back and watch that video. So Gloria, your thoughts on the French semi-acknowledging what happened on that fateful day, December 1st, 1944?
Yeah, wasn't it just I said last week earlier. I meant 2 weeks ago. We didn't meet last week.
Yes, last week. 2 weeks ago, yes.
Okay. 2 weeks ago, was it 2 weeks ago we talked about Diomaye Faye, where we just kind of talked about it, or maybe the week before that, where we talked about, what we're going to fight for people who we think are capable to move Africa forward. We'll fight for you. But while you're there, we need to see the impact. We need to see that those who lost their lives to get you there, did not lose their lives in vain. So we have, asked questions about Ousmane Sonko and Diomaye Faye. And if you're from Senegal, please let us know the great things they're doing, because we like to put microphones to stories that are suppressed throughout the continent. So when people do write, if certain regions of the world choose not to cover it, we like to put that microphone out. So please let us know so we can talk about it and praise them. But this right here, I find to be very impressive, because not long ago, Diomaye was at the White House and we didn't quite like the representation. But I like to see things like this. This is a case that has gone on for decades. And what we're seeing now is a huge contradiction to what France has always said, describing the event as a mutiny that they were forced to repress. And that's far from the truth. Their official claim showed only 35 to 70 soldiers losing their lives, again, in response to a violent mutiny. But Senegalese historians and descendants of veterans have asserted that the toll is likely closer to 400 people. And I like that this new Senegalese report is leaning more towards that. And basically, they executed these victims. Now, these people who were unalived were actually heroes of the war. They were veterans of the 1940 Battle of France, which had to do with German prison camps. They were only protesting against racial discrimination as far as their pay and pension benefits went. They were basically being paid a fraction of what their white French counterparts were receiving. Is that completely unusual? I don't understand it. So we're now in 2025 and we're still on this subject, and France is still saying, yeah, maybe, perhaps it kind of happened. Come on. But I do commend again Diomaye Faye's government. This is the best way to honor. The best, like the Chinese say, the Chinese proverb says, the best day to plant a tree was yesterday. Today is the next better day. So thank you for addressing it. Thank you for ensuring that these people were not, did not lose their lives in vain. Thank you for forcing accountability. Thank you for attempting to rewrite a history that was deliberately minimized and obscured for decades. But please do not stop here. We're going to keep our eyes on you, Diomaye.
Absolutely. So yeah, look, when I think about this, it's for all of those families who had, and many of them are much, much older now. And, this happened 80 years ago, right? So many of the people who witnessed this are long gone, or the people who were impacted are long gone. And just a few of them are potentially still alive, because this happened 80 years ago. You may have remembered it at a 4 or a 5-year-old, but there aren't many people who are in their 80s that are still alive today, right? And so, that's what these countries do. They acknowledge things long after the perpetrators of these actions are gone, right? So France acknowledging it now is like, of course they can acknowledge it, but they're still acknowledging it in half-truths, 35 to 45, really. So yeah, to your point, I'd like to see the government of Senegal take this a step further and get restitution for those families who's left and who would have been impacted for it. Because at the end of the day, not only were they asking for better pay, but now that they're gone, they could not continue to take care of their families. And so what ended up happening to all those families who lost those people who were working to take care of their families. One. Two, it really is unfortunate that these colonial leaders came and took soldiers from the continent to fight in their war halfway across the world, right? And then to unalive them after they fought in your war is nuts. But that was the world we lived in. And this happened all over the Western world. France is not the only culprit and the only ones who did something like this. But to this scale, I don't know if I've heard of anything to this scale. And so I do want to see Senegal take it a step further and get restitution for those families. Absolutely. It's absolutely needed. And memorials need to be created. There needs to be more to be done than just the acknowledgement of this, because I was not aware of this at all, to be honest with you. And I think, they need to be shamed and they need to pay for it. If France can still take restitution for giving Haiti back its or getting for Haiti getting its freedom, and they still take reparations themselves from Haiti every single year, then they need to be able to pay restitution to these families at the very least. And it needs to be done at a rate that matches inflation from 1944 till now. So those are my thoughts there. Moving on to the next story that we're going to watch a video from. There's a historic meeting with Russia and Morocco to strengthen ties. They signed a new pact. So Moroccan foreign minister and his Russian counterpart in Moscow strengthened their strategic partnership through a meeting. The two ministries signed a memorandum establishing a joint working committee to deepen cooperation and monitor existing agreements. So they highlighted that Morocco and Russia have signed 188 agreements across various sectors, one of the richest legal frameworks Morocco shares with any country. The ministers also discussed the Western Sahara dispute and the Gaza ceasefire. Russia reaffirmed Moscow's support for the political situation in Western Sahara, while both sides committed to expanding trade, energy, and agricultural collaboration through a joint commission. And Western Sahara, by the way, is some people recognize it as a country, some people don't. It is a portion of Morocco, if I'm not mistaken, and want to break off as a separate country, but I don't think Morocco recognizes them as a separate country. And so I think they're looking for support from Russia to keep it as part of Morocco, much like Russia is looking to make USSR again. So, I think that's probably why that was part of the discussion, because they're looking to have their assistance in continuing that. So we'll play this video and then we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Morocco's Nasser Bourita met his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and the duo praised the positive momentum in Morocco-Russia relations and reaffirmed their commitment to elevate the partnership to a higher level. Bourita and Lavrov signed a memorandum of understanding to establish a joint working committee between their foreign ministries. This committee would be tasked with reviewing progress, identifying new opportunities, and proposing initiatives to strengthen bilateral relations. Before concluding his visit, Bourita will co-chair the 8th session of the Morocco-Russia Joint Commission with Russian Deputy Prime Minister. The commission aims to expand cooperation in trade, agriculture, energy, and technical sectors. Since King Mohammed's ascension to the throne, Morocco-Russia relations have undergone a significant transformation. His visits to Moscow in 2002 and 2016 laid the foundation for the strategic framework that continues to guide bilateral ties till date. And President Vladimir Putin's visit to Morocco in 2006 further strengthened this partnership. Now, the Moscow meeting reaffirmed both nations' commitment to enhance ties.
Gloria, your thoughts on 188 signed agreements and this further strengthening of the ties between these two countries?
That's a lot of agreements. That's a huge statement. Diplomatic ties between Russia and Morocco actually date back to 1777, when the Moroccan Sultan initiated trade with the Russian Empress Catherine the Great. The Soviet Union was actually also one of the first countries to officially recognize Morocco's independence in 1956. So this is not a new relationship. It's basically a relationship that's just being revived. The relationship now, as we know it now, is actually, it brings to mind the 2002 Declaration on Strategic Partnership, which was signed during the visits of King Mohammed VI to Moscow. This provided the foundation for the extensive 188 agreements that we're talking about today. But the most critical political implication, and I'm glad you referenced it, Joe, is actually Russia's subtle but very significant shift in its traditionally neutral position on the Western Sahara dispute. While avoiding an explicit recognition of Moroccan sovereignty, Russian officials are increasingly, if you notice, using language that is more receptive to Morocco. So this diplomatic realignment, particularly ahead of UN Security Council discussions, is a huge win for Morocco. And clearly, it shows that there's a huge incentive for the deepening of ties with Russia. And I know America right now is just like, really, Morocco? So I guess y'all are not going to be invited to the White House anytime soon.
Yeah, I would say so. Because as you all who are watching are fully aware of the challenges with the United States and Russia, and the ongoing discussions about other things. And so, yeah, any countries that cozy up to them do pose challenges for the United States. And for Russia, as you can see in that video, right, this gives them access to all of the countries in that they've been communicating with on a regular basis. You know, one of the things that we talked about sometime last year was that Morocco had already spoken to the members of the AES about potentially giving them access to their ports and imports from the Atlantic Ocean. And so this makes it easier for Russia to not only do business in Morocco, but also across the Sahelian states or the AES. And so, or the Alliance of the Sahelian States, I should say, or the AES. So I'm interested to see how this continues to evolve. You know, again, ideally, we do more deals on the continents than we do with the East or the West. But, you know, look, as you mentioned, this is a centuries-long partnership. And so, you know, they're going to continue to do what they have been doing. But I'd like to see more of these kinds of deals happening on the continent. With that, that was the last video that we are going to respond to. But we did have some stories that we had that we wanted you guys to check out from around the continent. And those are a few. So I want to start with the, since there's only 4, I guess we could just go through them in order. So dozens of mourners were injured in Odinga Memorial in Kenya. That's what the Red Cross has reported. Any thoughts, and what should people be paying attention to with this story, Gloria? With this story, Gloria? Storia?
Yeah, it's just the same old suppression of people's rights to assemble, people's rights to speak, people's rights to support who they support. I mean, this was actually the viewing of Odinga, who, you know, they even referred to as Baba, you know, and for considering what's going on in Kenya, this is definitely not a good look. And my thoughts are just with people who were victims of this really tragic situation.
Absolutely. And again, continuing to do what they have been doing when people are gathering. You know, this is, you know, and just to I think to tie a bow on it, you know, this was political opposition leader to the current leadership, as far as I understand, right? And people were mourning his death. I think he died of a heart attack, if I'm not mistaken, or
yes.
Okay. And so people were there at basically a vigil, and if I'm not mistaken, gunshots were fired by the military or the police. And that created a stampede, which I think is where we saw the people experiencing injuries, and so serious injuries even, in fact. And so, you know, it's just they continue to do it, and it's just challenging to continue to hear this over and over again. And but what I am heartened by, I guess, is that the people of Kenya will still never give up, and they will continue to protest. And if anything, this strengthens their cause. Okay, Zimbabwe's ruling party resolves to extend the president's term to 2030. Thoughts on this story?
Oh yeah, it's only 2 years, right? And that way they can keep the 83-year-old man in power until 2030. And I'm not ageist. I'm not. Is that even a word? I'm not. You know. Yeah, it is a word. I'm not trying to be funny as far as age is concerned, but you know, yeah, it's sadly the story of Africa, and they just sit tight once they get there. You should check out a story I did on this recently. Actually, African leaders don't retire; they regenerate. I guess that says everything we need to know.
Right. So stay tuned to that story and see what's happening there. We'll continue to keep you guys posted. Next to Tanzania, authorities instill a climate of fear and step up repression ahead of general elections. Thoughts?
No surprise there. None at all. Samia, as we've established, is only one of two female African leaders that we have on the continent right now. And she's not been a great role model, you know, if I'm just going to say it as it is. But there's been a whole lot of repression of dissent under her government. Whether or not you agree with whoever the opposition leaders are, you have no right to actually stifle the media. You have no right to instill a widespread climate of fear ahead of the elections. This is clearly a strategy for you to entrench your party's power and suppress civic engagement. We've talked about Samia's governance repeatedly on this show. I look forward to the day we can actually celebrate her government, and Tanzania, especially the people of Tanzania. They deserve for their rights to be counted. They deserve for their mandate to stand.
Agreed, 100%. And unfortunately, what it seems like is another person who's used as a token to continue to do what they always do. Another person put in leadership, or even elected to leadership. Well, put in leadership. So we will see what happens when the general elections come, and we will have some reporting on that, or we will give our thoughts on the reporting on that when that time comes. And then lastly, Malawi has now set up primary and secondary school to be free. Your thoughts on that story?
Yes, same thing happened in Namibia when the other president was only, one of two female presidents on the continent. Those are the kinds of things we like to see. Okay, but anyway, and that way we can have more female leaders having a chance. You get what I'm saying? We're talking about equity and fairness. We need our leaders in general, anyway, to be great examples. But if you're like a minority and you find yourself in a position of power, just do right by the people. But anyway, speaking of, at some point, this president of Malawi, which we've talked about the story twice, he was president, got kicked out, came back, and now he's leading again. Even though I think he's 85 years old, we did talk about concerns around that. However, in Madagascar, Rajoelina was in his 50s, and the people were not happy with him. So, and we've talked about the fact that Diomaye Faye, for instance, is the youngest leader on the continent right now, and we want to see more. So yeah, age is a great thing. It's something we should consider because it does matter. But we need you to work regardless of your age. So shout out to the president of Malawi doing his thing. I mean, people are, critics are concerned about him overburdening the education system due to a massive financial challenge to maintain quality. And this is all amidst the inevitable surge of new enrollment. But I do like the idea of breaking the cycle of poverty, opening up secondary education to millions of children whose families could not afford the costs. And when you take care of education, when you enlighten the people, you watch, Africa will rise and just keep rising. So kudos to Malawi. This is on a great note, and we hope you continue. We hope it's not a case of initial gra-gra, as we like to say in Nigeria.
Yeah, and just one point of correction. I think Faye is the youngest democratically elected leader, I think.
Oh, democratically. Oh, I'm sorry. Democratically elected.
Presidents, yes.
Thank you, Joe.
Because Ibrahim Traore is what, 37, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so he's younger than Diomaye. Okay.
Yeah. But to your point, though, I think the youngest democratically elected one. But yeah, so I do hope that these kinds of updates continue. I mean, I think people sometimes learn their lessons when they're in office. They lose power and they come back.
Yep.
Let's hope and see that. Let's hope that he does more. These are all small wins, but any step in the right direction is better than a step in the other, right? So we'll take our small wins. I have a friend that always says a win is a win is a win. So we'll take that small win. So that concludes the live stream. We for the first time have done it in an hour.
Are you throwing shade at us?
At both of us. So look, I want to say thank you guys all for watching it this long, and if you stuck with us to the end, and if you found this interesting, give us a thumbs up. Make sure you share this with anybody who's interested in any news happening on the continent. Make sure you subscribe to the Gloria AO on YouTube, and then follow her on all other platforms. If you're from her content and you're watching her content, make sure you come over and subscribe to Authentic African. With that, we want to say thank you for watching, and we'll see you all on the next live stream. Bye, guys.